Hello, this is Dr. Kraus, and I'm trying to help a student debug an issue with using an Arduino and an H-bridge to drive a DC motor, and I thought I would just make this publicly available in case it's helpful to anyone else. Just in terms of context, so we use these L298N H-bridge boards that are available on Amazon for a really reasonable price to drive DC motors using a PWM signal and two enable signals from an Arduino. In the case of this particular student, they think they've got the code right, but they're getting 0 volts over here on the terminals to the motor. And I'm trying to help them figure out why that is happening. I talk in the video that I recorded on a different device that I'll splice into this, just about using this thing, but just to have some stuff in the back of your head to understand what I'm doing. One thing that's crucial is because of another part of the project, they're including servo.h, which affects the ability to use pin 10 as a PWM pin. These are my final answers for the recommended pins, but the student starts out with pin 12 as the PWM pin, which doesn't work as expected because pin 12 is not an analog output pin, and so it's not capable of PWM. So this is some of the code that's at the top of the Arduino file, and then in the heart of it is kind of this main function called set motor direction and speed, where you pass in a direction that should be either an F or an R. Just to get it to fit on the slide, I threw out the code that handles neither F nor R, not recognized, and just prints an error message. And then it also takes a speed. So depending on whether we want the motor to turn forward or in reverse, we adjust our IN1 and IN2 pins that go to the H-bridge. They cannot be the same. So if one is high and 2 is low, then it turns one direction. And if you reverse them, it turns the other direction. If they're both low or both high, then nothing happens. And then this INT my speed is a PWM value between 0 and 255 that determines a duty cycle that gets sent on this PWM pin, which is connected to ENA on that L298N board. And then inside so the setup function handles, turning on the serial and setting the pin modes and those kinds of things. And then in the loop function, it's basically just checking, has the user sent me any new serial input? And if they have, then let's call this set motor speed and direction function. So either they sent me an F or an R, or they sent me a number between 0 and 9 that corresponds to a certain motor speed that I want sent. So with that, I'm going to switch over to the other video where I talk through some of my debugging steps. And the specific symptom that my student is seeing is that there is 0 voltage going to the motor, even though they think in software they have sent not 0 to the analog right. But if I check, so this is a ground here, and this is the PWM signal, I'm still seeing 0 here. Specific to this student, I think part of the issue is that they're using pins 12, 10, and 11, and specifically 12 is the PWM pin. And you can see that there's not a tilde on that, meaning it's not a PWM output. Additionally, I'm going to show you, because we're also using a servo to steer this robot, that pin 10 will also not work as a PWM pin. So the first thing I'm going to recommend in order to try to debug this is to disconnect power to the H-bridge, disconnect any power to the Arduino so that nothing is powered, and step 1, I want to verify that I've got common ground. We beat this into our students' heads, but this is going into the ground of the Arduino, and if I go over here to the ground pin on the H-bridge, there is continuity. So step 1 is a pass. The other thing I want to show you as far as getting ready to debug this, ordinarily the students would have jumper wires going from the H-bridge directly into from the Arduino directly into the H-bridge. In order to be able to debug this, I got to be able to make measurements inside of here. So I've taken jumper wires from the Arduino and to the H-bridge, but this allows me to then connect an extra jumper wire to make a measurement at any point, which again specifically tells me that in this situation, I'm seeing 0 volts on my PWM. And then interestingly, and this is where I'm starting to think that I believe I know what the problem is. If I come over to my Arduino software, right now that pin is set to 113 out of 255, which is below the halfway point. And my claim is if I set it to something greater than 128, now what I'll actually see is that I'm at 5 volts. So when I try to do an analog write to a digital pin, if I send it less than 128, it will output 0. If I send it more than 128, it will output 5, and it will do nothing in between. So PWM on a digital pin is really just a digital write, not an analog write. So just another sanity check for my own purposes. I swapped the PWM pin from 12 to 10. This brown wire is where it's going over on the H-bridge. And my expectation, so I've got analog write of 198 going out. And because I've got include servo.h in my Arduino code, it messes up the PWM on pins 9 and 10, and that's just a known thing that you just have to deal with. And so even though I'm sending 198, I'm still seeing 0 on my, so it should be like 4-ish volts, and I'm seeing 0 on my DMM. So last step, I'm going to swap the PWM to pin 11 and verify that that solves the problem. So my PWM pin is on pin 11. I have written 141 to my analog write, and now if I come out here, I'm getting 2.7-ish volts, and I can also verify, sorry I don't have enough hands to do this, that if I, for example, sent it a value of 85, I'm getting 1.68 volts, 1.64 volts, sorry. And if I come out here to where we originally had the 0 reading, we're now seeing that there is voltage going to the motor. The other thing I would, so I'm using a valid PWM pin that is neither 9 nor 10, but it does have the tilde on it. And also would verify that these enable pins, one of them should be reading 0 and one of them should be reading 5. So the orange one is 5. The yellow one is 0. And so that specifies a certain direction, and if I were to swap them, it would be the opposite direction, but they can't be both 0 or both 5, or it just won't work. So make sure you're using a valid PWM pin. Do not try to PWM on pins 9 and 10 if you're using servo.h. And then if you have to debug further, you're going to have to find a way to get a DMM measurement in between here and here. So to summarize what I think I have shown, step 1, verify common ground. And at least check that all the wires do connect to a common ground. Would strongly recommend verifying with a DMM that you actually have continuity from the Arduino ground to the H-bridge ground. Additionally, if you try to use analog write on a pin that doesn't have the little tilde showing that it's a PWM pin, then your analog write is really just going to be a digital write. So if you send it something less than 127, you're going to get 0 volts. If you send something more than 128, you're going to get 5 volts, and you're not going to get anything in between. Additionally, if you include servo.h, then it is known that that breaks the PWM on pins 9 and 10. So just be aware of that fact. And if you do all of those things and you still need more information, then you're going to have to use a breadboard to be able to go in and make measurements in between what's coming out of the Arduino and what's going into the H-bridge. Hopefully this is helpful. Thank you.